Why we're this close to teleporting. A quantum physics story. Danny Martins was dreaming of the girl when he was yanked from what felt like momentary bliss and anonymity by the shrill ring of a phone. He stayed stubbornly motionless, reviewing in his mind what the problem could be, why anyone would want to call him so early. The shrillness remained, piercing his numbed skull. Maybe the newspaper office? Couldn't be. Danny had dropped off his story and spools the evening before. A classmate? Not likely. Very few of his friends had his new apartment number. Danny raised himself on his elbow, found to his amazement that it was even earlier than he'd figured. The room was still flooded in darkness. Angrily, he reached out into the murky blackness where his bedside table was and tore the receiver from its cradle. "Martins," he breathed vituperatively. "Morning, Danny boy. Sorry to get you up like this." It was Jerry, his beat colleague at work. "Boss wants to see you pronto at the office. Need your help on some of those Johannesburg fire pics you took last week. I'll tell him you're on your way." Even before Danny had a chance to speak, the line was dead. Martins rubbed his eyes as best he could to functioning mode. The LCD clock face cut a screaming red 3-digit figure in the darkness. He stumbled into the bathroom. If he hurried, he might catch the next bus at the all-night depot. There were a dozen bleary-eyed commuters clustering close for warmth at the rear of the bus when Danny climbed on. On every cold-pinched face, Danny read a scowl, more striking than if an appeal court judge had slammed a gavel on an uttered condemnation. Danny was being cursed for getting on, for bringing in the cold after him, and for holding them up the one more minute that brought them closer to home. With an instinctive movement of the hand, Danny lowered his woolen cap over his ears and slumped into a carved-up seat. He tried to mind his own business. The rumbling bus cleaved a cautious trail through the glistening wet streets, exited the suburb, deep into the city, the same route Danny usually followed to morning class. A little up ahead, the bus would swerve sharply into a poorly tarred siding and head left for the newspaper office. He may as well button his eyes and grab the tail end of sleep while he still felt a need. He set his mental clock to shake him awake before his stop. A soothing blackness swathed his tired body. The real world moved around Danny, skipped into a series of gyrations that moved further and wider away from him until Danny's sense of location was scattered, and he found events before he had ushered in sleep impossible to recall. Danny had been cut loose in a swirl of memories. One image in particular appeared to him in great clarity, the face of a young woman. A girl he was sure he had once shared many adventures with, but when and where exactly, he could not remember. Danny latched himself fervently to the image, as if in fear of losing it. Her features burned a permanent outline in Danny's mind. That face, that glorious face, radiant with an awesome beauty, reflecting intensely a warmth and goodness unlike any Danny had ever beheld. Danny wanted her. He staggered breathlessly with the mental portrait of the girl, a sight so captivating and enriching to his senses, it threatened to lure him and jam him forever in a state of confounded bliss. Though Danny embraced the prospect of being fastened to her throughout eternity, heedless of its possibly being a fool's paradise, he was abruptly yanked out of his reverie by a crescendo of questioning voices all around him. Danny pried his eyes open with his fingers. A yawn would have followed, but for the unexpected sight that confronted his dazed eyes. Either he had mistakenly gotten on the wrong bus, or the driver had missed a turn somewhere back in town. Instead of being nearer the newspaper office, the bus was climbing the hill road that led the opposite way to the front of the university campus. Danny jerked forward in his seat. All the other passengers were clearly as startled as he was. Many of them were chattering nervously through frozen lips, staring over each other's shoulders toward the fore of the bus, where the driver sat muffled in a great coat, his eyes focused like magnets on the road before him. Danny stood up. Mouths instantly ceased conversation, and all eyes turned on him. Danny threw the longer half of his scarf around his neck and grappled his way to the driver. The driver's eyes were the first indication Danny got that something terrible had occurred. Instead of being contracted for protection against the blinding cold, they were wide as saucers, the pupils fixed straight ahead, unblinking and red, with an uncanny glow, as if his eyes were lit by some internal energy. "Hey, mister," began Danny, reaching out to touch the man's broad shoulder. The driver had obviously lapsed into a trance of some sort, as he himself had been in danger of doing some moments before. Danny thought it discreet to ruffle the solid composure of the unmoving driver. It had been a miracle to have gotten this far down the road, unhurt, but allowing this human automaton to continue was stretching good fortune's hand. "Hey, mister!" The driver's head didn't turn to the sound of Danny's nervous voice. Instead, his whole body rigid and robot-like, he moved a hand off the steering wheel, activated the left turn indicator, and changed gear. The bus decreased speed. Maybe it was a little fanciful, but Danny couldn't help feeling the bus driver was subconsciously carrying out the pre-calculated will of an unknown and out-of-sight entity. Sending plumes of snow onto the sidewalk, the bus skidded to a halt, directly in front of the university campus. The door hissed open. Danny looked out, his gaze skipping across the snowed-over campus from one building to the next. His mouth fell open. But this was too much. He didn't want to be at university today. It was out of the question. He was expected somewhere else. The other passengers were staring at him. He sensed they were angry. He was the cause of the mysterious detour. He was to blame. The bus driver's head moved for the first time. Danny felt the man's intense red eyes bore fear into him. Danny said, "I didn't want to come here." The driver's eyes remained fixed on Danny's already twitching face. An uncanny foreboding permeated like a shiver through the body of the undergraduate. Behind him, he felt the stabbing of sneering, hostile faces, and the driver's unrelentless stare quelled any desire for argument Danny may have had. Danny resigned himself to the demand of the moment. He alighted. The glass door snapped shut, barring him immediately from getting back on. The bus pulled away from the curb and choked into the smutty snow of the main street. Danny zipped his sweater up to his chin, pulled his woolen cap down over his ears, and shoved frozen fists into trouser pockets. What should he do now? First things first. It was cold, and he had to get warm. The next priority was locating a phone and informing Jerry back at the office that he was going to be a few minutes late. He wouldn't explain why. If word got out amongst his colleagues that he, the Tribune's most brilliant and alert and already rumored best-salaried member of the news staff, had gotten on the wrong bus to work, not only would he be made the laughingstock, but the mockery would make a serious dent in the respect he had been so tirelessly trying to earn. But damn it! He hadn't gotten on the wrong bus. That was the most unnerving fact. The driver, acting presumably on someone's orders, Danny couldn't understand what possible reason the driver himself could have had depositing him on university ground, save possibly the man had a keen maternal interest in seeing that he got the best of his education by attending classes as often as possible, had deliberately neglected his daily itinerary to ensure that Danny failed to arrive on time at work. Danny was confused. What possible reason could anyone have for preventing him getting to work? And to go so far as convincing a public driver to completely countermand his morning route and drop him elsewhere against his wish at the sake of other passengers' appointments was beyond Danny's understanding. Somebody didn't want Danny at work just yet. Or maybe the whole day. Danny's mind, always prone to searching for outworldly explanations to the commonest of everyday occurrences, had become uncontrollably wild. An inexplicable desire to find out why all of this was happening was foremost in his thoughts. Danny had to find out why. There had to be some reason. Danny kicked parabolas of snow into the air as he ran across campus, making for the golden-hued gates of the University Museum of Art, the closest place he was sure had a working phone. With some difficulty, Danny scuttled through one of the ajar gates, up the slab-like memorial stairs, and pushed open one of the glass doors. The warmth inside the building instantly touched his cheeks, cleaved through sodden clothes, and brought feeling back to his numb limbs. There was no one in attendance at the main desk. In fact, there seemed to be no one in the main gallery at all. Loosening the scarf round his neck, Danny made for the phone. His sneakers echoed through capacious halls, it seemed the only sound indicative of life in the building. At the desk, Danny waited. There had to be someone around. Etiquette forbade him to make use of the phone without asking permission. Danny drummed a nervous tattoo on the counter, hoping the echo would bring someone out from behind a mural painting or unyielding sculpture. No one materialized. Danny cleared his throat. A moving shadow pulled his vision to the left, but when he had the chance to examine the left side of the principal gallery a little longer, he found nothing there, save for an upright, black-cowled figure, faceless because of the shadow cast by his high hood, but motionless. No doubt one of the gallery's prized possessions. The U-shaped curves of the cloth and the impression of fine silky texture were immaculately conveyed, but Danny had no time for the appreciation of art. Disregarding what his guardians had reckoned to be good breeding, he reached for the phone behind the counter and punched for an outside line. Jerry had presumably slipped out of the office and was nowhere in the building, the receptionist at the newspaper office said. In fact, she believed Jerry hadn't come in at all this morning. However, in light of Danny's reassurances that Jerry had indeed called him from work, the lady remained confused and not helpful enough. He mumbled an apology anyhow and said something about being in town within the hour. On replacing the receiver, Danny found a note addressed to him on the counter. A note he was sure had not been there only a minute before. No big deal, Danny told himself. Someone must have emerged from a back room somewhere, recognized him, but on seeing his back turned to the counter, chose rather to leave a note than disturb him and communicate the message verbally. The only mystery about the whole affair lay in the message itself. Danny, you're now curious to find out what will happen next. I'll be in psychology class this morning. So will you. Your friend. Danny shot a furtive glance around the room, and then at his chrono. He had 5 minutes to get to the lecture in question. And the lecture hall was on the other side of the university. He'd be late, but he'd be there. Everything had been going contrary to the plans he had for the morning, and he wanted to know why. This couldn't go on. Maybe some crank was onto him. He didn't know. He just wanted to see this nonsense through. Maybe someone in the psycho class would start producing answers. He hadn't intended being in class this morning, and here he was. And though the last thing he wanted on a Friday morning was to sit in on one of Professor Barrow's lectures, he was already mentally plotting the swiftest route to psychology class. Danny folded the note and pressed it into his trouser pocket. He was jogging halfway across campus when it came to him that on leaving the gallery, the black-cowled figure had disappeared. Danny inflated himself with courage and muttered an earnest prayer before pushing open the lecture hall doors. Danny loathed being late for class, especially Professor Barrow's lectures. But it was essential that he show up. Hopefully the anonymous writer of the note would reveal himself and do some impressive talking. The guy was probably sniggering in his seat now, seeing Danny enter the class. Though Professor Barrows did not break off reading from his textbook or introduce surprise into his tone of voice, he did raise a diabolical eyebrow past the rim of his spectacles. Danny sensed Professor Barrows was giving him enough time to settle in so that he could spring a barrage of questions on him. In between shuffling through his canvas bag and opening notepad, Danny tuned into the scene, tried to get a feel of what was being discussed. It was imperative he caught on quick. He guessed Professor Barrow's next question would be directed at him, and his grade might depend on the insight shown by his answering. Professor Barrows liked updating pre-sentiments about pupils at the oddest times. To a Swiss clock professor like Barrows, An unreliable chronograph or a disregard for punctuality was an unforgivable sin. "One unbecoming of young neuropsychologists like themselves," he admonished at intervals of his terms. It was usual for him to give Danny 2 minutes to grasp the situation, and then open fire. Professor Barrows was saying, "And there's nothing extraordinary about mentally controlled molecular rearrangement. The subconscious mind is the vehicle, and positive visualizations the fuel of a healthy subconscious mind. By positively visualizing in the screen of your mind an event that you earnestly desire and believe will come to pass, activate your subconscious mind into manifesting your wish. If the subconscious mind has power over the occurrence of events, always manifesting in the real world that which we call upon in our dreamlike state, there is no reason why there should be any limitation to what the subconscious mind can do. Medical cases have often proved the tendency of patients to treat many of their own maladies by visualizing themselves rid of the sickness and in a condition of super health. When questioned, they report to having wished the malady away. Cancers and ulcers have been mollified and disintegrated, the result of mentally induced regrouping of molecules in the body. The list of self-treatment cases is endless. Anorexia sufferers, arthritic and myopic patients, once again reinforcing the point I'm trying to make. A spontaneous surge of mental energy, being possibly a great desire to have something happen, what in layman's terms would be termed willpower, can often generate enough mental power capable of triggering off a degree of creative energy, and in some extreme cases, molecular regrouping. Patients discover they are able to regulate their own blood pressure readings. Athletes are able to improve on their high jump records. Depression sufferers discover mental resistance that enables them to control pain. Businessmen are able to seal that $1,000,000 deal. Trained astronauts are able to lessen muscle tonus and fall asleep instantly. Some tribal groups in Africa, the ostrich men, are able to lower breathing patterns to a minimum. Quite a feat when you consider that mental energy has to be fueled at the same time by great quantities of O2. If the mind is then able to control molecular regrouping within the body, surely the converse is also true. The mental abode should be capable of producing enough energy to regroup molecules outside the human form, whether part of the human form or not. There are examples of the regrouping of molecules associated with inorganic objects. However, they extend far into the realm of parapsychology and would serve no more in this discussion than to act as stories of interest. Suffice it to say that spoons have been bent and tumblers have been shattered, but psychologists have come no closer to becoming edified as a result of their extensive tracts. As far as the regrouping of organic molecules is concerned, there have been examples of what parapsychologists refer to as teleportation cases, which relates directly to our discussion. Human beings can regroup the molecules of organic entities, even if it be themselves. The point I wish to make here, though, is that it is not so much the external reformation of molecular structures that interests the psychologist, as it is the mental processes occurring at the time of such external rearrangements. This needn't be complicated to you all. You'll be writing exams on it. From what we understand of the mind today, it is certain that the subconscious mind is an entity with great power of control over the events of the world. It has both the capacity to regulate both processes directly pertinent to it, in this case, bodily and mental related functions, and to bring into alignment processes external to itself, in this case, the regulation of any object outside the perimeter of mental energy of each individual. Mental energy, as we shall collectively term all the mental processes pertinent to molecular regrouping, operates on a space-time dimension. Thought can be projected both backward and forward in time. A thought input can be given ambivalence. Such an ambivalent thought input can continue to travel both backward and forward in time, so that alignment with other thought processes can occur. Similarly, that ambivalent thought travels through space. One can mentally project one's understanding of events within a room without necessarily being present inside the room. And certainly, though supposition, too, tends to undermine such studies, sensorial isolation studies indicate the already mentioned mobileness of the mind. There is one conclusion to it all, gentlemen, ladies, that if the mind is mobile, such mobility must conversely retain the power for molecular regrouping in an external environment to itself. Do you all understand what I mean by that? Huh? Why does the silence disturb me so? Professor Barrows stood, sweeping his small and alert eyes along the rows of students. People, he began in his most patronizing tone of voice. I am speaking of the space within which the mind can fit. What I term the apple grid. Whether the mind is able to flatten out over an immeasurable grid-like distance, or whether it is able to fit in an area no larger than that ruled by an apple, is immaterial. It participates of a dimensional level unrestricted by solid barriers and enclosed spaces. Why is there still such a numbed look about you all? Go home and ravish your textbooks. We'll speak more on this in tomorrow's lecture. Danny was surprised. No questions today. As students began clearing the hall, Danny detected the absence of movement from one of the students in the 15th row. The room empty, but for himself and the fellow up front, both lounging in a sea of padded blue chairs. Danny wondered who should make the first move. Surely the writer of the mysterious note left for him in the Arts Museum should approach him. After all, he had invited Danny to psychology for an explanation. Danny reckoned he'd wait a while. Maybe the guy was nervous about something. But the fellow up front betrayed no desire to leave his seat. Danny found curiosity too demanding and got up. Listen, neighbor, I've been humoring you long enough. Your practical joke ends here. Now, either you explain what this is all about, or I'm going to turn into the Hulk. Danny supposed himself lucky afterwards for having escaped the confrontation alive. The guy in row 15 was Nick, the leading senior class authority on tournament hockey and recognized as the university's most oppressive rocketballer. Structurally, Nick was a giant, easily capable of calling Danny a Lilliputian and folding him up and fitting him into his breast pocket. Mentally, Nick was a vegetable. How he had made it past even the 5th grade surprised Danny. It was rumored he sharked a lot and threatened timid students into doing his homework and projects for him. An ignorant dropout in class, Nick served the universal purpose of acting the villain in the piece when one was called for, at least where Danny was concerned. Nick and Danny had rubbed flared noses before. Always they had sparred verbally, Nick's inability to deliver powerful and intelligent retaliatory remarks, gaining Danny numerous easy victories. Danny, of course, was always careful never to provoke Nick past the stage where blows were invited to settle a dispute. On this occasion, Danny had taken things too far. He had mistakenly allowed himself to be swept by an unexplained dramatic air, and without realizing until too late who the guy in row 15 was, had taken Nick by the scruff of his neck and pulled him backward. As it turned out, Nick was stuffing his podgy face, and Nick detested being disturbed when eating. He considered it in poor taste. Cavity of mouth bunged tight with part of a homemade double-decker Brussels sprout sandwich, Nick wheeled on the seat of his pants to face Danny. His eyes popped wide when he saw who the audacious classmate was. Danny was equally surprised. He had to clench tongue between teeth to prevent himself from swallowing it. He quickly unhanded Nick, praying the giant footballer ask for an explanation before he just let his fists fly. With unbecoming grace, Nick placed the half-eaten sandwich on the open book he'd been browsing through, then slammed it shut so that green moisture jetted from between the pages. Nick got up, swedging the wrinkles from his denims with the palms of his callous hands. Towering over Danny like some overgrown graminivorous insect out of a horror movie, Nick thumbed down the ball of moist food he had in his mouth in a single, impressive, onomatopoeic gulp. Danny was too spellbound by the act of delectation to think of fleeing the hall. Nick began rolling up his left sleeve. Danny coughed. "Whoa, Nick, old chum, what are you doing here?" "Waiting for my girlfriend. But you?" Now, Nick, It's a misunderstanding. I'm all to blame, I assure you. I didn't see it was you, but I guarantee it won't happen again." In this moment of darkness, Danny still had time to be facetious. "Do we have an understanding here? Could I have a show of hands?" The words were poorly chosen, without foresight, and Nick instantly, and in all his brutishness, read them to be the invitation he'd been waiting for. Moving rearward, Danny forgot the half-dozen steps that would normally have conveyed him in a dignified way to the door. Sneakers being rubbery as they are, and having little grip on polished surfaces, Danny fell away before a lumbering fist collided with the side of his head. But Nick was not one to be robbed of a blow. Rolling up his right sleeve, he gave chase to the cartwheeling Danny. But fate felt propitious that morning and spared Danny. At the moment when Nick took hold of Danny's jacket and scarf and got ready to bawl him out into the passage, a small copper-haired girl with bright blue eyes in a white top and shorts, bobby socks, and shoe-laced sneakers appeared. Nick's girlfriend, Charlotte. And that was the second thing about Nick that surprised Danny. How cute little girls could find themselves attracted to this overgrown moron. It is true, Danny had a soft spot for Charlotte. He'd always had. Perhaps, analyzing things beneath the surface, it had been one of the sources of friction between the two undergraduates ever since they had found themselves in the same class, trying to win over the same girl. But though Danny may have harbored fantasies of a night out with Charlotte, he had never acquainted her with his affections. In the 4th month of their term at university, on finding Charlotte was dating Nick, Danny resorted to having her as a friend. He dispelled the fantasies and set about conning books every night until the sun shot an eye over the city. But he never truly forgot Charlotte and what could have been. Charlotte glared when she saw Nick place his large, hairy paws on Danny and lift him, ready to pitch him through the push-open doors. Charlotte's yelp froze Nick in mid-action. "Nick, are you brawling again? Will you let go of Danny?" Nick felt indecision sweep over him. Just when he found himself on the verge of showing Danny who was really the boss in class, Charlotte was imploring him to show compassion. Clawing at the open space beneath him, Danny caught a glimpse of the beautiful Charlotte. But the girl did not remain Charlotte in his imagination. She became someone else as he stared on. The unknown girl who had pervaded his subconscious as he slept the past couple of nights. "Leia," he gasped, awestruck by a beauty he could only yet weakly visualize. Charlotte herself was amazed by the sudden inability on Danny's part to recognize her. In rage and unable to decide what should be done, Nick made a discordant sound and threw Danny aside. Charlotte ran forward, knelt in front of Danny, and asked him if he was hurt. His side bruised, Danny breathed he was fine. Charlotte gave him a reassuring smile, nodding her head all the while as if to say, "When will you guys ever grow up?" Did she think they had been fighting because of her? She patted his arm, then said, "It's Charlotte, by the way, not Leia." She joined Nick, who placed his arm round her waist, and they walked out. As if things weren't going wrong enough, when Danny got to the offices, Jerry refused to admit that he had called Danny that morning. "Oh, come on, Jerry. It sure as hell was you. It was your patronizing voice, all right." "Not me, I tell you. Check with the chief. I've been in a meeting all morning." "I don't understand it." Jerry shook his head adamantly. Danny was too dumbfounded. "Listen, Dan, oh boy, get the hell out. If the boss sees you, all that'll be left of your day off is a note of regret in tomorrow morning's obituary column. And you'll get no sympathy from Jerry here. Read me. Now scram!" Danny was already making his way toward the elevator. Danny slumped into bed when he got home, his last observation being that he should have stayed in bed. He'd shun daylight for an hour or two and catch up on the sleep that had been bereft him. It became obvious soon enough that sleep wasn't the answer to Danny's present dilemma. Rather than reward him with a tranquil moment to adjust his understanding of what happened, it presented him with a mass of questions that seemed to carry no answer. Questions about events so unrelated they made Danny turn in bed. What reason could someone have had for going so far as to divert a public bus from its presumed morning course to prevent Danny from getting to work that morning. Danny was still stuck on that one. But hold it! Hadn't Jerry angrily elbowed him in the ribs for turning up at work on a day he was meant to be soaking up for himself? Jerry swore he hadn't called him. And though Jerry often cast avaricious eyes on many of the editorial awards Danny had stacked on his desk, he wasn't the mean kind. So, if Jerry hadn't called, who the hell had? And if the motive wasn't to keep him away from work, what was it then? The driver of the bus had done something totally against what his schedule demanded and taken the university route. That meant someone had wanted Danny on campus when he, in fact, had not desired going into university at all. Closer to the truth still, the note in the arts gallery had indirectly demanded his presence in the morning psychology gathering. Why? To encounter Nick and his girlfriend? And then there was the matter of the girl he'd been thinking of when he awoke this morning, the girl in his dreams on the bus, the girl he had mistakenly taken Charlotte to be and whom he had called Leia. All the same girl. This girl. Danny paused in his thoughts. Who was this girl? A classmate? He thought carefully, but he couldn't place her. Then where had he seen her before? And why did he feel it important to think of her at this moment? How could she be tied up with what was happening to him? He had to know. The girl meant something, but he didn't know what. For a moment, he desired her presence madly. Why wasn't she near him? Where had she gotten to? Dreamily, Danny molded the pillow to his face. Whoa, he reminded himself. I don't even know who she is. So why do I feel so lost without her at my side? What's the explanation? He questioned the possibility of his need for this mysterious and unknown girl being a subconscious creation reflecting the desire he had had all along for Charlotte. But not. He felt positive about the differentiation he had made. Charlotte and the girl he had called Leia were not one and the same. There was something more refined about Leia, something also bespeaking playfulness, yes. Perhaps the smile, the rosy curves of the cheeks, the perpetually smiling eyes, but also the shadow of fear reflected in the eyes. A fear that somehow gave her demeanor an air of certain and unshakable demureness. For a moment, Danny wondered what fear was in her eyes. He wanted to know because he wanted to dispel it, to help her. He knew why he cared about her terribly. He had tried not to admit it, had tried to keep his emotions in check, but now he was sure. He loved her, and he had loved her before. But when and where, he could not say. He was so confused, so hurt. She could not have left him. She had loved him too, he was sure. But for some reason, she had had to go, to leave him to flounder in the whirlpool of his life. Why? He wanted her back. Someone was going to have to help him find her. She had to come back, because knowing it only now, he had been waiting a long time for her. Danny traced the image he had of the girl in his mind, and keeping his eyes tightly clamped, he got out of bed and sat himself before his bedside table. A blind hand reached out for a crayon, and then a foolscap sheet of paper. With a nimbleness he never knew he possessed, his hand moved over the paper, pencil point etching into the grain of the paper. His eyes continued to shun light. Danny understood what he was doing. He was sketching blindly the image in his mind. So strong was his desire to have a physical copy of that which he held in his mind that it seemed his hand had gained an energy that gave it life of its own. Danny wanted something he could reach out to, something tangible. A drawing on a piece of paper was far from being adequate, but it was a start. He had to take the pain out of his head, the desire to have something he was not really sure had ever existed, except in his imagination. Danny was halfway to completion when the desire to see what he was doing became too overwhelming to be ignored. Two fissures opened in the upper region of Danny's head. A surging ocean of light pierced the picture in Danny's mind, distorting it as if it were melting plastic, tearing it to fiery shreds. On the desktop in front of Danny, stared back, in beautiful artistic proportion, a half-completed face of a girl. A girl so desired by its creator, it had been blindly conceived. Danny sat, unblinking before the drawing. Though he had failed to render the same glistening, smiling eyes, they still held life. They were real. She was real. He knew her. He did. God, he knew she was real. But where? Where? Where begin to look? God, where? A glinting film developed over his eyes and began collecting in the corners of his eyes until it became too heavy to contain and rolled down his face. Danny covered his face with his hands and, like a little boy, began whimpering. Danny remained huddled in his seat for some minutes, then rubbed his eyes with the palms of his hands and got up. He headed for the kitchen. The coldness of the tiled floor hurt his feet. The kitchen, being located centrally in the apartment, was dark, with the result that Danny did not notice the man in the kitchen until the fridge door had been opened, light streaming out, illuminating Danny's all-too-familiar world. Danny dropped the carton of milk he had taken from the fridge. A pool of whiteness spread with many fingers across the floor. "Don't be startled, Daniel. It's only me," came the reply. "Darn it, I know it's you. How'd you get into the apartment?" Greg York had been a close friend of Danny's since the fall of first semester. Their friendship had been strongly founded on the fact that they had both attended the same Mozart concert one evening and found thereafter that they were studying at the same university. Indeed, in the same class. But the musical concert had not been the only place where they had encountered. On many occasions, Danny had attended a function only to find Greg there too. Almost as if Greg were following him around, which was ridiculous, of course. However, as a result of all their unexpected encounters, they discovered they shared many interests. Greg York was an intellectual, a suave academic who wore jeans and never remembered to crop his hair. Danny admired Greg for the coolness with which he approached problems, for the deceptive picture of a washed-out student Greg succeeded in projecting. But Danny knew Greg too well to know the man was no washout. Greg was destined for great things, for the bringing about of important affairs. Because of Greg's attitude to his work, he shunned publicity and vowed always to operate as a sequestered scientist. Greg was a background man. Greg was too serious about his work to let people make a sideshow of it. He'd rather forfeit the credit on a TV show, knowing history inevitably exposed and awarded true deservers, than have to explain the workings of his mind to masses of ignorant viewers. They wouldn't understand, he felt. They couldn't. They were the hundreds of low IQ'd, benefiting from the discoveries of the hard-working minority. Greg would remain a background man. "How did you get in my apartment?" Danny asked again when Greg failed to reply. "Your front door was open. I walked in." Danny had to think a while. "Oh," he mumbled. He wasn't going to argue. Greg was perhaps right. So much had happened today out of its recognized mold that Danny felt he could no longer find security in anything he should have been sure of. He thumbed the kitchen light. 2 rods of light broke the darkness in varying hiccups of fluorescent brightness. Danny excused his unkempt appearance, then offered Greg a drink. Greg shook aside the offer. Danny set about mopping up the spilled milk. Greg detected a certain absent-mindedness about his friend, which initiated his asking, "You feel okay, Daniel?" Greg sounded fatherly in his concern. "Yeah, no problem. Must be the class tests making me so jittery." "Your eyes. They're red. You been crying or something?" "Late night." "Not good for the overall balance of the mind," said Greg, almost more to himself than to Danny. "Spare me, Greg, and sit down, will you? You're making me feel even more uncomfortable." "Can't. I came round to return this." Greg held up the floppy disk they'd worked on 2 nights before, preparing for their math exam. "I've done some working through it. Has some valuable pointers. Thought I'd bring it over. You might need it. Algebra is going to be a real challenge. Thanks, Greg. I'd forgotten all about it. Danny went to his room to drop the disc with the others, and noticing the drawing of the girl, he picked it up and wondered if he should show it to Greg. He just asked Greg if he knew the girl. Nothing else. He wouldn't mention his affection for her. Greg wouldn't understand it. He didn't know why he felt the need to show Greg. Why involve Greg? He questioned himself. Somehow it just seemed the sensible thing to do. Perhaps because, right now, what Danny needed was the help of someone he could trust. Someone with a logical mind who could disentangle the whole perplexing mystery. He took the sheet of paper gently in both hands and said, "Greg, could you come in here for a moment?" Greg's silhouette filled the narrow doorway. Greg could not possibly have deciphered the art on the sheet of paper in the parsimonious light filtering in from the kitchen, but still he answered in a guttural monotone, "I've seen her before." And then, as if anticipating Danny's next question, "I think I know where she may be found." Like two rubbery figures caught in a surrealistic scene, Danny followed Greg out of the apartment. They were back at the university, sitting at a table in the upstairs canteen, overlooking the activity on the campus below. Danny wasn't questioning what was happening, and it was clear from the tightly drawn expression on Greg's face that Greg wasn't interested in explaining either. He guessed only they must be waiting for someone. Danny stared at the canteen clock and made a swift mental addition. They'd been sitting in that crowded canteen 34 minutes without saying a word to one another. Danny's eyes swept over the throng of students, grabbing trays and serving themselves, chatting to classmates with full mouths, tapping feet in time to the canteen's music. Danny slapped the table with an open hand and sat back, displeased. "Get off it, Greg. Explain. I respect your thriller movie approach, but I've waited long enough." "You want to see her, don't you?" Greg's reply was an angry retort, as if he were blaming Danny for the loss of valuable time. "She's going to be here?" Danny felt as if a rug had been pulled from under him. He was unprepared. How would he react when he saw her? What would he say? Feeling threatened by the situation to come, Danny withdrew into himself, riffling rapidly through mental files of Humphrey Bogart one-liners to help him through the confrontation. In the process of withdrawal, Danny's vision shifted from the overall atmosphere of the canteen to the unoccupied booth alongside their own. A collection of polystyrene cups, some half filled with soda, and some paper plates from which sandwiches and helpings of gravy chips had been eaten, jostled for position on the table surface in the next-door booth. 4 people had sat at that table. Why should that matter to Danny? Danny and Greg had been sitting there, according to the chrono suspended from the ceiling in the center of the canteen, 37 minutes. Danny recalled that the booth had been empty when they had entered the canteen. A shiver shot through Danny. They'd been waiting 37 minutes when in reality the answer had been staring them in the face. Danny shoved his chair out from under him and shuffled to his feet. Greg remained seated and showed no surprise. Danny stepped into the booth, his eyes focused unmovingly on the cups and plates. "She was here, wasn't she?" Danny asked Greg with certainty flashing in his eyes. "She and her friends. You wanted me to realize that, didn't you?" Greg remained unmoving. He gave no answer, only observed. With unexplained certainty, Danny reached for one of the cups and pointed at a particular space on the table. To himself, though audibly, he said, "She sat here." Greg still did not answer, but his small, piercing eyes remained fixed on Danny. Eyes Danny had seen before. The eyes of the bus driver. "She sat here. She sat right here, didn't she? As we were entering, she was leaving." Danny rushed at Greg, grabbed him by the lapels of his jacket. "Damn it, Greg, please! She was here!" Danny sought reassurance. A string of glinting, watery beads chased one another down his left cheek. Danny was crying. Greg snapped into wakefulness, pressed on Danny's wrists so that Danny would let go of him. "Control yourself. People are watching." A number of students had collected around them on seeing Danny reach out violently for Greg. Now, they were eagerly awaiting Greg's reaction to the assault. Greg cast a look over his shoulder. He disliked people intensely. What did they want to see? Why did they have to turn ugly and crowd when they were confronted with an unexpected event? Taking his friend by the shoulders, Greg pushed Danny out of the canteen in front of him. "What the hell's come over you, Daniel? You losing your cool?" "Take me home, please, Greg." Greg stared quizzically at Danny. "Greg, I'm sorry. I don't know what's come over me. Now, please, just take me home." The cars parked around the block. Danny sat mum in the car. He felt he'd lost Greg's respect. Greg would never look upon him again without remembering how Danny had allowed emotion to overcome him. Danny recalled Greg's high regard of people who were emotionally mature. Danny hated himself. What had happened to him anyway? Having gotten so close to Leia and not being able to see her had disturbed him more profoundly than he'd imagined. How could a girl be doing this to him? What mystical power did she hold over him? It had to be supernatural. There was no other explanation for it. Danny was a mathematician, a logician. At least he had always been. He was supposed to be invulnerable to the unsystematic emotional chemistry of the world. Though Danny could answer neither of these questions, he was positive of one thing. Danny had made a coxcomb of himself in front of Greg. In an academic world, an uncontrolled display of emotion from a science scholar bespoke the fall of his brilliant mind. Was that Greg's opinion of Danny now? A fallen comrade? Unfamiliar shop fronts and boulevards shunted Danny into conscious thought. "Where are we going, Greg? This isn't the way home." "We're going to the res. She's a sleep-in student." "Greg, no! Forget it, please. I want home. I need to think a while first." Greg paid him no attention, gave his request no thought. The car turned into a long paved driveway, cleared of snow, presumably a reception parking apron for students. Greg got out, told Danny to wait for him, said he wouldn't be a minute. When he returned, he said, "I've just spoken to a friend. I took the liberty of showing her your artwork, and she confirmed what I already knew. Your Leia is a resident student." They locked the car and walked across the grounds into a cold gray hall. Their shoes resounded from the naked concrete walls. They climbed the stairs onto an upper level, then walked a corridor that curved to a right, forming a crescent that spanned half the building. They halted at the third door from the passage end. As Greg's hand moved to knock, the door swayed gently open. Greg shot a raised eyebrow at Danny, the most Greg ever did when betraying perplexity toward a situation. The various belongings in the one-room apartment reflected accurately the character of an occupant Danny instantly felt he had once been very familiar with. The room was modestly, though very neatly arranged. In one corner, beneath a hardboard poster of a 1959 Cadillac Fleetwood 60 Special sedan parked at a skating rink, was a low duvet-covered bed, on which a council of conferring bears, pandas, and sprightly dressed dolls had chosen to sit. A wooden study table with a half-dozen books on archaeology, an open examination pad, an orange stationery box, and a radio caught the rays of light coming through the single window. Propped up against a miniature bookshelf stood a 6-string guitar. Danny was roaming about, too concentrated and too fascinated by how much he still recalled of Leia to notice Greg say, "No one's home. Let's wait outside. Perhaps she went for coffee in the refectory." The open pad was too much of a temptation for Danny. Though he could not give himself any reason, he wanted to know what she'd been writing. He recognized her handwriting when he saw it. The almost negligible right slope of her capitals and stemmed letters. The neatness of format he recalled, too, as if he had read a letter of hers only yesterday. Danny's eyes zigzagged over Leia's notes. Most of them were concerned with study plans. The rest were personal. A reminder to phone a friend. A letter Danny gathered had been written to her mother or father. It was incomplete and hadn't been signed. The letter did not say much, but one paragraph in particular struck Danny as odd. I don't quite know what is really happening to me. One moment I awake, and it's as if I'm living, waiting for something to happen. I can't quite explain what it is, but I'm afraid. I wake up in darkness to find I'm muttering in a strange tongue that will be only familiar to me when I'm elsewhere. And then there's that recurring dream. The boy. Someone I'm sure I knew once so well, and now he's lost somewhere and needs help. My help. Oh, I'm so confused. I wish I could be home. I really do. But I can't go. Not until I'm let free. They watch me night and day. I'm so frightened. The paragraph went on, but Danny felt he'd read enough. His darling Leia was undergoing the same torment as himself. He awoke nightly dreaming of her, just as she did of him. He had no doubt that the boy Leia mentioned was himself. He had no doubt, too, that they had been intimately connected once in another time, in the past. Now he was sure they had to be reunited, and that something Leia was sure she was waiting for to happen was approximating Danny's destiny. And the matter of her mysterious guardians seemed quite familiar to Danny, for it had been happening to him, too, for some time. Since the fall of the semester, he had been watched all the time, observed, and manipulated like a puppet. No wonder you've known all along, Greg. You knew what I'd drawn even before you'd seen it. I didn't show you the picture of Leia. You knew her name without my telling you. You guessed all my questions ahead of time. My feelings about you were right from the beginning. You knew all along what I'd soon be looking for. You knew where and at what time she ate. You knew where she was staying. You've known everything for a long time because you're behind the whole thing. You're the background man. Those initial meetings at the concerts were planned, not coincidence. The voice on the phone this morning, cleverly disguised. But you, the bus driver, you, or one of your associates. At least his eyes were yours. The black-cloaked figure in the Arts Museum, you. The note on the counter I found after phoning, you. Greg remained silent and expressionless, his piercing eyes fixed on Danny. Explain to me this. Why should you show up this afternoon in my apartment at the moment when you knew I most needed someone to help me? Anyone who walks through the front door of an apartment doesn't hide behind a fridge until he's welcomed, Greg. Why are you doing this to me, Greg? Why? Want me to go nuts? I can't hide it from you, Greg. You know I love the girl. I don't exactly know what she means in my life right now, but I need her. You know that like you've known everything else. So why stop me? God, Greg, please help me. A faint, though obnoxious smile crept slyly over Greg's solid features. Danny was in despair. Greg, please, please tell me where she is. What have you done with her? Please, I'll do anything. Please, I'll do anything for you. Please, Greg, God knows I need her. Greg, I beg you, I implore you not to overlook the respect I've shown you, the moments of friendship we've shared. Please, Greg. Greg said, You're crazy, Daniel. Danny thrust himself at Greg, began to pommel him with his fists. Greg, you bastard! Why the hell are you doing this to me? What have I done to you? What's the meaning? With one arm, Greg loosened Danny's grip on his jacket and threw him out the room into the empty hall. His face torn beneath the eye, a liquid warmth spread into his shirt. Danny had never imagined the sheerness of Greg's strength, and now that he'd found it, he feared. Greg stomped out of Leia's room into the corridor, that same thin smile still apparent on his face. Danny couldn't understand why Greg was doing this. They were fighting. Greg would kill him. Greg, the paragon of civilized men, had turned murderer. Greg! Gasped Danny, trying to scramble to his feet, but the floor was too slippery with his own blood. Greg, what are you doing? Have you gone out of your mind? Horror widened Danny's eyes. With one swift movement of the heel of his shoe, Greg drove his shoe into Danny's heaving ribs. Danny keeled over in agony. Greg's foot was coming down on him for a second injury. His entire body writhing with vibrating pain, Danny nevertheless found an iota of determination not to let Greg finish him off. Danny cried out as he curled his body upward to meet Greg's assault. His tightened hand succeeded in grappling Greg's leg, struggling with it, and then throwing him backward. Danny had just about enough time to get up on his knees and crawl into Leia's room. Inside, he latched the door, bloodying everything he touched. He pressed his eyes shut, as if such an action would extinguish the pain jarring through him. He thought of the danger just outside the room. Where to now for safety? Where? While the door remained locked, he was safe. But already he could hear Greg shouldering the door. Any moment now it would give way and come splintering in. Danny could find no damaging enough object toward which he could look for succor. An edge of metal-sharp pain coursed through his upper body, causing Danny to tighten in defense of it. He couldn't move. It hurt too much. "Oh, Leia, where are you, my beauty? Call out to me. I need you. Please, think of me now." Danny's mind raced through a plethora of the day's recorded images. The call that morning that had gotten him out of bed. The dreams of the girl he had then discovered to be Leia, the companion, so he presumed, with whom he had spent his childhood. The sneering, angry faces on the bus. The driver's unearthly eyes. The unmoving figure in the museum. The frightening form of Greg in his darkened kitchen. And the faces in the canteen looking at him on grabbing Greg's jacket. In his mind, Danny ran the plethora of recorded images backward, this time covering in more detail what he could remember. Something told him that in the day's events, he had been shown the escape key to this nightmare. The dreamlike drive up to the res slipped hazily through his mind. Other images materialized and dissolved in the same way. The outburst in the canteen. The admonition he had received from Jerry at the office. But one image remained locked in his head. The lecture. He saw Professor Barrows delivering his lecture, spectacles perched on tip of nose, reading from the textbook. He saw himself enter the lecture hall and riffle through the office briefcase. He recalled Professor Barrows' words. "That if the mind is mobile, such mobility must conversely retain the power for molecular regrouping in an external environment to itself." Only now did Danny understand the full gravity of Professor Barrows' statement. The mind could manipulate molecular structures outside its normal parameter of operation, in this case, not only the structure of molecules of objects outside the human body, but the entire human body itself. In this way, the mind, through a spontaneous release of energy, could transmutate molecular structure and transport them through space, assembling them elsewhere in another space and time continuum. It had been done before, with the teleportation of objects through space. Telekinetic movement of objects. Certainly, the mind could do wonderful things. The mind therefore operated both from an internal position and an external one. Conversely, Danny realized, the mind, being capable of projection unbound by the laws of space-time, had to be able to take the body with it when it moved. And how could this be done? Professor Barrows had said, "A spontaneous surge of mental energy, being possibly a great desire to have something happen, can often generate enough mental power capable of triggering off a degree of molecular regrouping." Certainly the urgency was there. Danny wished with all his heart for the comforting presence of his beautiful Leia. And the need was there, to flee the danger now beginning to shatter the door of the room wherein he had locked himself. Danny made his whole frame rigid, so that the pain seemed to disappear and a flush of warmth began to envelop him. He became heedless of the danger now tearing closer to him, so that it almost breathed down upon him. A feeling unlike any he had ever felt before soaked through his cells. A light emanated from within his body, soon becoming so refulgent it seeped through the surface layers of his body structure, throwing up the illumination in the room, and perhaps even the room's temperature by a few degrees. The room windows misted, and the refills of pens spilled forth polychromatic inks. Triggered by the surge of mental energy, the molecules in Danny's body vibrated in the space they occupied. The mind was first to move elsewhere. The structural molecules composing his body followed suit. By the time Greg had entered the room, Danny's huddled figure had shimmered out of existence. Only Greg's smile still served to continue the story. When the soothing feeling of weightlessness had vanished, Danny opened his eyes. He felt quite stiff, though more at ease mentally. He found himself in a richly furnished room, curtained and arranged to great taste. He was evidently in some luxurious antechamber back at the university, although he could not recall ever being in it. There was a certain kind of pedanticness surrounding the neat stacking of tomes, the ordered location of opened books, the symmetric configuration of sharpened pencils, obviously suggesting the concern of some parlor maid with the room's general appearance. Thick-set purple curtains inhibited the penetration of natural light into the room. Only a series of evenly spread-out candles served to give the room any illumination. Numerous metal objects glinted on sideboards. A large mahogany map table imposed on Danny's vision. Laid out before him was a splendiferous Persian rug, unfaded by light or the treading of feet. The whole room, in fact, seemed newly arranged. Danny moved his head from side to side, taking away the stiffness there. He touched his face where his eye had nearly been torn off. It had stopped bleeding, but a tremor of pain still pulsed in his cheek. He carried himself to his feet, found he had only a slight difficulty in walking, and began toward the door. He wasn't going to wait around for someone to ask him the questions. He felt he was being observed, and it made him wary of hidden traps. He placed the palm of his hand to the doorknob, and it tingled his fingers. It was electrified against his attempts to escape. The lock was unopenable from the inside. Perhaps he should try the window. But before he could even get near the window, the large hickory doors opened inward. 3 structurally impressive men in tight black suits entered busily, sealing the doors behind them. The first thing Danny noticed they all had in common was their eyes. They looked like Greg's, like the bus drivers, large, placed at an angle on their faces, and piercingly cold blue in color. The middle man moved behind the arranged desk, while the other 2 took their places on either side of the large mahogany map table. The middle man looked jovial to see Danny. "Consider yourself fortunate, Dr. Martins. Please do not think the appellation an incorrection on my part. It still humors me how the level of one's self-actualization can be expressed through one single socially devised and recognized title. I've not yet grown accustomed to the idea, quite alien to my comprehension." Danny was too startled by the man's unexpected familiarity, sharply in contrast to the harshness of character with which everyone had treated him in the past couple of hours, with the result that Danny could not bring himself to utter anything until he was quite certain whose side the middleman was on. "Yes, but you are fortunate, Dr. Martins. Like the others, you will be remembered and honored. You should feel quite a sense of accomplishment. The others did, although there were exceptions. There always are. Unfortunately with you, it has been slightly more difficult. Please forgive the unorthodox methods of getting you here, but they were necessary, and methods, after all, change with the time. I'm afraid that the only language you would understand was a subtle dose of violence. As a result, it has succeeded in finding you here." "Ah, yes. Silence. You don't know what to say. Have a drink. It'll make you feel better. I suppose your fragile structure has to first overcome the shock." One of the map table men passed Danny a tulip cup filled halfway with a golden liquid. "There you go." The middleman permitted himself to smile briefly and continued persuasively. "Drink. I made sure it was the way you would prepare it. Dry whiskey, 1 cube of ice. Oh, darn the specifications, but I suppose they're necessary." The middleman paced the floor in front of Danny. "Our people have never really openly admitted their alien origins to your people. It's been relatively impossible up until now. Encounters have been limited and brief and always cryptically conducted. None of you were then so open-minded. Oh, sure, Franklin and Edison met 1 or 2 of us, necessary to abet them with their findings, though it wasn't quite as overt as what's happening now. You see, I can talk to you, Dr. Martins. You're the product of a new age, educated along different patterns of thinking. Your generation has been brought up with a media full of aliens. We're everywhere on Earth. There are regular reports of us being sighted in numerous localities on Earth in all the newspapers. Your entertainment houses fancifully portray us as invaders, and on occasion as friendly, though not pleasant to look at life forms who get stranded on Earth. Your generation is certainly more open-minded. Unless I picked up the wrong history manual this morning. Oh, no. The middleman sliced a fish into a projector and ran a forefinger through the columns of writing quickly. Danny had the curious feeling that the consultation was being hurried along, much like a bureaucrat would try to confront a dazed taxpayer with a mass of confusing information in as short a period of time as possible, planned to get him over and done with, but with little peace of mind. Ah, yes, the middleman sighed with relief. No, I was right. The date today is the correct one for the purpose. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. The other inventors and evolution advancers were certainly great. Your species has had its sporadic geniuses, those who chose to follow their, dreams, but they needed a slight push at times. Euripides certainly needed to be told to analyze more closely what he saw when he was painting. Pasteur had to be helped too. Oh, it's useless me telling you all this. There are numerous of your people I could mention, and you would not fully understand the significance of our efforts. Darn it! You see, your blasted civilization is taking too long to get where we need it. We've got to assist your people, accelerate their progress any way we can. Our survival as a species depends to a large extent on it. Oh, sure, we've waited thousands of your years. We gave your first primitive men their fire because they were taking too long to discover it themselves. We helped you out of your dark ages. Now it's time to bring your people 1,000 or more years closer to helping us. We're going to be needing all the help we can get from every race in the known universe against the enemy. And what a notable enemy they are. Sure, your little feat has advanced your people 188 years into the future, but only 188 years. That's how we work. We regularly dole out the secrets of progress, but we are always sure never to overdo the degree of information that we hold. Much of what has been given to your civilization cannot be controlled by the leaders of your world. Nuclear power is a good example. Our efforts take time. We don't have much of it, but we're also limited by the quality of progress methods and ideas we're permitted to give out. The middleman turned his back to Danny and mumbled, We are old, though your stars are young. Things don't ordinarily happen overnight, unless you're familiar with the ecosystem on Rigel. We comprehend the waiting process. We'll continue waiting. However, I seem to have run away with myself. It's been nice talking. The middleman straightened out some loose sheets of paper and successfully communicated the impression that their meeting was through. Danny hadn't touched his drink. He had been too concentrated on the words of the middleman. Now, he wanted to ask questions. Why am I here? What? The middleman's joviality ceased on his face, became a fixed stare of anger and outrage. You don't understand? No, damn it. I haven't understood a word you said. The middleman turned to face his escorts on opposite sides of the map table. Bring the girl! Leia? Danny whispered excitedly. She was here? Of course, she must be. He had so strongly visualized himself finding her that he had found himself here, talking to this madman who had obviously lost contact with reality a very long ago. One of the middleman's assistants left the room, only to reappear shortly. Yes? Questioned the middleman. The girl. She's scheduled for termination in the next room. This moment. The words seemed to reverberate like hot steel through Danny. The agony was immeasurable. She was in the next room and she was going to be harmed. The girl he had cared most for, the single individual he most longed for, the lovely, innocent Leia. With a chilling glee, the middleman turned to face Danny. What will you do now? He asked, almost as if he knew already what Danny's next actions were to be. What are you all doing to us? Questioned Danny. The three men slowly converged on Danny. Danny turned to flee. There was only the window. He raced for it, throwing back the thick-set purple curtains. When exposed, what lay on the outside seemed more threatening than what Danny was running from. Danny squinted with horror at the scenario beyond the glass partition. Stretching out beyond his ability to focus were seething mud flats, colossal blue granulated rocks, huge plants opening into dire leaf-like developments, like some grotesque scene viewed from underwater. Only a series of smears for clouds and low-slung suns on the horizon emanating rays of light served to dispel Danny's belief that they were harbored in a life support unit in a submarine forest. Danny turned to face his antagonists, Committed to saving Leia at whatever the expense to his own life, he drove into the three men, not once thinking they might be as strong as Greg had been. Fending the blows of the three men from all angles, he speared through their legs, into the hall, taking advantage of the already open doors. The second man had left them open on entering to inform the middleman of Leia's scheduled termination. Danny's eyes goggled in horror at the promenading figures outside in the corridor. Mouth-slobbering Ursinoids, who suddenly fell into a bedlam of baying when they saw Danny. Danny crashed into the room across the hall, and there he found his beautiful Leia, strapped across a table. The metal straps cutting into her flesh were inconsequential to what Danny was sure he could do. Holding her tightly, selfishly to his own body, he relit the surge of mental energy in his head, absorbing it quickly through his whole body. Once his own cells were sodden with the binding light, the flow of energy melded with that of Leia's. In seconds, both their bodies were fired with vacillating energy that again began to vibrate the molecules of their glowing bodies, ready to transport them from their immediate area in space. Both Danny and Leia had shimmered into forever by the time the three men had entered the room. None looked surprised. It had been expected. Yes, Danny Martins had been pushed slightly more than any other individual belonging to the human race, but he had been steered into accomplishing a great thing: mentally energized travel through the space-time barrier. In a million or so years, after a few more advances had been thrust on Danny's descendants, man would merge into a close alliance with the mouth-slobbering Ursinoids and assist them to defeat their enemies. The abetment of Danny Martins had been a necessary stride in mankind's evolutionary development. Any life form in the universe had the liberty of manipulating another in reply to its need for survival. The three men were pleased. The middleman had to smile at the ingenuity of their plan. In the end, they had all gotten what they'd wanted. All of them. Danny was fully conscious of what had happened when he arrived on Earth the night before. Because he had been wary of waking Leia up, after all, he had no idea how her body would react to the energy that had coursed through her cells, he had placed her in bed, held onto her tightly, and fallen asleep at her side. In the morning, Danny was staring at the beautiful Leia when she emerged from sleep and opened her eyes. The most striking eyes he had ever looked upon. How very beautiful she was. She groaned with the weight of sleep still upon her, and turned to Danny. "You're staring," she said, smilingly. Danny was relieved that she couldn't recall the events of the last few days. Obviously, the middleman and his assistants had wished only that Danny should know and remain enlightened. "You're so lovely, Leia. As beautiful as any princess could wish to be." Danny moved closer to her and kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes, the smile never leaving her lips. "You always say that, Danny. Sleep a little more. I wonder sometimes if you really mean everything you say. I'd like to see you cross a universe for me." Though Danny said nothing this time, a smile appeared on his face as he sank back in the pillow.